Beloved, let's join our hearts in prayer. Holy God, there are many voices speaking in our minds and bodies. There are many stories being told within us even now. And your voice, your stories, your truth, your wisdom are already there among them. So all we ask, God, is that you invite forward in us what is curious and honest and imaginative and brave, that your word might emerge from our hearts, reverberate in this space we share, and send us out into the world in love. Amen. The word comes to us today through Genesis 32, verses 22 to 31. The same night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything he had. Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. The word of the Lord. You know, I've always loved this story about Jacob wrestling with God. Something about it has always seemed so true to me, so resonant, so familiar. Somewhere along the way, things go off the rails, and we find ourselves wrestling with God. I do, anyway. We resist and fight and struggle and strive and scramble and survive and hold on tight for our blessing. And I don't know, I guess I've also always been drawn to a story with a turning point. You know what I mean? A fulcrum, a pivot, a kind of hinge that separates the past from the future, a point after which everything is completely different, after which everything is forever changed. Because you hear people talk this way, and it's always made me very jealous, stories of loss that kind of turn on a dime. But then I found Jesus. But then I got sober. But then I met the love of my life. But then I landed my dream job. But then I became a parent. But then I started therapy or yoga or drinking mushroom coffee or drinking enough water or getting enough sleep or doing cold plunges, or I got off social media, or I got a bullet journal or a standing desk or an air fryer or a bidet. Or I found my tribe. I found acceptance. And then everything changed. I think that's part of why we feel drawn to this story, or it's part of why I have felt drawn to it at any rate, because we love a good turning point. Jacob fights hard, he hangs in there, and he gets blessed. He gets a whole new identity. And man, do I want a turning point. But I don't know. It's never gone quite that way for me. I remember once hearing an older colleague say that it is totally appropriate for a pastor to preach from their own experience of struggle as long as those struggles are now totally resolved. You can see where this is going. If that's the case, I should probably never talk about myself in the pulpit. I'm not sure there is one thing in my whole life that feels totally resolved. And I think that's why when I turned to this well-trodden passage this time around, it wasn't Jacob's wrestling that most drew me in. It was the limp that he's left with at the end. The end result of this mystical encounter may well be a blessing, but it is a blessing that takes the form of a life-altering injury and a permanent limp. And if we read on, things actually don't get any easier from there. They don't resolve at all. It's not the turning point it seems to be. The name God gives to him, Israel, is said here to mean the one who struggles with God. Maybe foreshadowing that this wrestling match is only the beginning for him and for his people. Yes, Jacob shifts from a life of deception and running away, but he shifts to a life of struggle. Yes, he goes on to reconcile with his brother Esau, whom he betrayed, and where there might have been violence, they embrace and weep into each other's necks. But as the story unfolds, Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel, dies in childbirth while delivering his youngest son, Benjamin. The rest of his sons will grow jealous of his son Joseph and sell him into slavery, telling Jacob he's been devoured by wild animals. And Jacob's descendants, well, suffice it to say, it's going to be a long story. The midnight wrestling match is just the beginning. The landscape Jacob is going to have to navigate isn't any more level or smooth than the way he's come so far. In fact, the terrain will be tougher still, and with a permanent limp, he'll have to learn how to walk slowly and carefully through it. His vulnerability will make him conspicuous in the world. This night is a turning point for Jacob, but it's not the kind of turning point we might hope for. His deliverance is not out of life, but into it. I think this is maybe another situation where the original language, Hebrew in this case, may be more interesting than the English translations. The New Revised Standard Edition New Revised Standard Version says, when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint. The Hebrew words translated here as hip and socket are kaf and yarek, and that's not wrong, but there is, I think, a little bit more to it, because kaf can mean a hollow, like the palm of the hand or the sole of the foot, the concave part of a spoon or a bowl. So it could be the socket in a ball and socket joint like the one we have at our hip. But elsewhere in Scripture, the term suggests the underside of the leg. And the sense is deepened by the use of the word yarek, which can mean hip, but can also be translated loins or groin. It may come from an unused root meaning soft. In fact, in Genesis 24 and 47, Abraham's servant and then Joseph swear vows by placing their hand under the thigh of their patriarch. I'm glad we don't make our wedding vows and ordination vows this way. But the reason I'm zeroing in on this isn't just to gently scandalize you. It's to stress that the site of Jacob's injury is significant. The outside of the hip is where a sword might be worn, but the inside of the hip, the hollow, the soft part, is in that ancient world what one commentator calls the locus of power, procreation, promise, and purity. So this injury isn't inflicted on an arbitrary body part. It is to the softest, most tender, most vulnerable center of Jacob's humanity and identity that this blow is delivered. And it's a serious injury. The word yakah, translated here as out of joint, can mean dislocated, but the root also carries the sense of being torn away or wrenched apart. In fact, it is related to the word used to describe the grim, ancient practice of publicly displaying the executed bodies of wrongdoers. So the sense here isn't that Jacob can simply pop it back in and go about his day. This injury changes him. And I think it's worth naming because many of us in this room, maybe most of us, maybe all of us, we know what it is to be wounded in our softest, most vulnerable places, to have parts of us torn away. We know what it is to suffer an injury to the very center of our being that will change forever the way we walk through the world. And the sort of healing that can come in this case doesn't heal us back to the way things were. It can only heal us forward for the road ahead. I think of the queer Mexican artist Frida Kahlo, who contracted polio at the age of 6 and was left with a limp, who was then in a terrible streetcar accident at the age of 18 that did permanent damage to her spine, ribs, shoulder, and pelvis, who suffered through multiple miscarriages and emergency abortions and more than 30 surgeries, who battled depression and addiction, who lived with chronic pain and mobility loss, eventually becoming an amputee and a wheelchair user before her death at just 47. She once wrote in her journal, "I am disintegration," end quote. But in between, she turned pain into art. She painted her pain in this graphic, visceral way that was both beautiful and gruesome, and it shocked the world. But it also gave voice and space to all the private pains of those who came to look. She painted herself with nails in her face, or incisions down her back, or arrows shot through her. But she always painted herself staring straight ahead, quietly strong, demanding to be seen, surrounded with all the vibrant color of life. She titled one of her most famous paintings with words from the beloved Mexican song Cielito Lindo, calling it "Tree of Hope, Remain Strong," telegraphing to the world the possibility of strength and hope alongside pain. I think of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was also left with a limp at a young age as a result of polio, who came from a poor black sharecropping family in Mississippi, started picking cotton at age 6, who suffered a non-consensual hysterectomy at the hands of a white doctor and a 4-day beating at the hands of white police that worsened her limp and left her with permanent damage to her kidney and to her vision. She claimed that beating made her hard as iron. And she went on to become a champion of voting rights. To pave the way for disability rights, she exposed the violence of racist segregation and insisted that economic justice was part of civil rights. She connected bodily autonomy with civil rights and social justice and became a model for grassroots organizing all over the world. Like so many nameless others, they limped through life, permanently changed by the wounds they had suffered. But they limped through life in pain, with honesty. They lived toward beauty, toward justice, toward goodness, toward peace. I think of the Apostle Paul, who wrote, "A thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I appealed to the Lord that it would leave me, but he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness.' He said, 'I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ, for whenever I am weak, I am strong.'" I think of the resurrected Christ who invited the disciples to know him by his wounds, to touch his hands and feet and side, and so to begin to understand what a resurrected life really meant. Not a magical undoing of unspeakable wounds, but a real life that persists in the presence of wounds and beyond them. And I think of many of you who in your own ways limp through life, changed by wounds to the softest, most tender, most vulnerable center of your humanity. Wounds that I don't believe God wills. Wounds that no one would ever choose. And yet, with God's help, I see so many of you finding ways to make them mean something. And in a strange and unexpected way, these things seem to lead us all deeper into life. In the case of Jacob, this wrestling match will not be his last experience of pain, but neither will it be his last encounter with the God who loves him or his final blessing. In loving defiance of my older colleagues' advice, let me share with you something that is totally unresolved in my heart. Several weeks ago, my cat died, and I was completely undone with grief. Part of me judged myself for being quite so devastated, but I was. We had her for 15 years, as long as my marriage, longer than both my kids. She lived with us in 3 homes in 2 states. She lived through births and deaths. She was there with us every movie night and Christmas morning and family meal, supervised while we gardened, slept beneath my arm, kept me company while I wrote sermons, came running to offer comfort whenever a baby cried. There are too many stories to tell from this pulpit, although if you find me elsewhere, I will gladly indulge you. A little too gladly, perhaps. But I'll just say this. She was my friend. I'm trying not to cry. I'm trying not to be the guy who always cries in the pulpit, but like my daughter said recently, I just want to see Kitty again. In the grand calculus of the cosmos, and even in the context of this congregation, and this community, in this moment, this loss is just a tiny personal one. It certainly pales in comparison to Jacob and Frida and Fanny, Paul, Christ. And there's something about each new grief that sort of touches every other grief. I sometimes picture an ancient monastery with a long, cavernous corridor full of bells, thousands of bells, and the mallet of grief strikes one, and then they all reverberate together. Grief does that. Pain does that. But it did something else in me, too, that was sort of mysterious and strange for me. I was so full of feeling, I felt like I would burst, and I cried a loud, sobbing cry, you'll be very surprised to know, and was largely immobilized for a few days. And then suddenly I felt something welling up inside me that I have to call just life. Nothing that I did, nothing that I, no way to engineer it. It just came. And suddenly I felt driven by this mad desire, which I think maybe is God's grace in disguise, to dig a grave for my cat. Never dug a grave before. Turns out it's pretty hard. About 2 feet down, you hit clay. So many hours later, with a post-hole digger, sweaty, bloody, dirty, and sunburnt, I felt like there was more that needed doing. And I realized that I really hadn't attended to the yard where this grave was dug for more than a year, too overwhelmed to address it. And soon the whole family was swept up in this project of beautifying and caring for all of these living things. And I couldn't stop there, and I was sanding the picnic table and staining the picnic table that I've neglected for 15 years also. My hands just kept filling with all these little tiny acts of love because something precious had ended. And love needed somewhere to go. Death, in this weird way, moved me to tend to life. And it kind of united our whole family in these tasks in a way that we hadn't been in quite some time. And somehow we were all together being dragged back to life together, drawn into a deep communion of pain and purpose. And I wonder if that's what this mysterious encounter between Jacob and God was all about. Maybe Jacob needed to learn that he need not run from pain. In fact, that he cannot. But that in some mysterious way, feeling the pain, living into it, limping past it, this was all somehow tangled up with life and our experience of it, with being drawn in. Somehow the wound Jacob carries forward from this encounter becomes an ongoing invitation to go slow, to ask for help, to lean into relationship, to lean onto the grace of God, and to go forward into life. Jacob is led by God, by this encounter, by this wound, to a different kind of life. He finds that the world that he returns to, he sees it differently now. He moves differently through the world. But as he does, he finds God with him every step of the way. And he finds himself fully alive. And I think that's God's hope for all of us. Amen.